Right, session 2, we've done some of the politics. This session is going to focus on the Brexit negotiations, some of which obviously are done in public, if you're a fan of the Barney A. Davis Roadshow, a lot of which understandably is done behind the scenes. I'm Chris Morris, I'm the correspondent for BBC Reality Check. I've spent previously about 10 years in Brussels in 2 stints. The last one was the 4 or 5 years running up to the referendum. We obviously know roughly where the negotiations are at the moment. Perhaps the government reckons about 75% done. I'll be corrected if that's not the case. We have agreed legal text in principle on financial settlement, on citizens' rights, and importantly now, in principle, on a 21-month transition after Brexit. But of course, we all know big issues still to be resolved, the Irish border, and we haven't even started negotiating yet on the outlines of the future relationship. Very briefly, let me introduce our panel. Alex Ellis is Director General at the Department for Exiting the European Union, has also worked in Brussels, both for the UK government and the European Commission, working now, we must emphasise, for the UK government. He is, of course, a civil servant, not a politician, so anyone desperate to ask the why are you doing this question, I'm sure he will deflect with ease. Jean-Claude Piris has certainly been in Brussels longer than anyone else on this panel, former Director General of the Council of the European Union's Legal Service. If you're a fan of EU treaties, he wrote most of them, so it's good that he's here. Simon Usherwood, a reader in politics at the University of Surrey, a Deputy Director of the UK in a Changing Europe. Clear winner, I think, of today's Best Tie Award, and I know he's going to talk more about his tie later. And then on my immediate right, Catherine Barnard, Professor of European Union Law at the University of Cambridge. And I have to say, the last time I spoke to Catherine was for a programme I was doing on Radio 4, and I made her talk about the relationship to Brexit of both Dennis the Menace and Status Quo, and that was the rock band Status Quo, not the transition Status Quo. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised that she's actually agreed to sit next to me.
Done a power of good to my academic career.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. So we will do the usual format. I'll ask each of the panellists to speak for about 5 minutes. They'll have a bit of a chat, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. Alex, you're the insider. I'm going to ask you to go first. You're among friends. You can obviously tell us everything you know.
If I did that, thank you very much, Chris. You'd still have room for the Quran, as they say. Thank you very much for having me along this morning. And a few usual disclaimers. I am a civil servant. There are others, frankly, within civil service who are better placed than me to talk about the negotiation, but I have some experience by comparison, particularly with negotiations of the past, working in the Council, working in the UK representation to the European Union and for the European Commission as well. And when I first started in the UK rep to the EU, I got an early bit of advice from Sir Stephen Wall, the permanent representative who I used to sit next to. And very early on he said, whatever you do, don't try and take on this guy. Because he wins every time. So I'm not even going to try. So what I thought I'd do, rather than talk about the substance, which all of you will talk about in a great deal more detail than I can, just give you a little sense of how the negotiations feel, particularly sometimes compared to how they felt from my previous experiences in the EU. The first obvious thing to say is that no one has ever done this before. So there is no template for how you do this. There is a treaty article, but this is new. Yeah? No member state has left. And the EU knows how to deal with third countries. It's done that since the start. And it knows how to deal with enlargement. At one point in my life, I was a sort of coordinator for the enlargement which took place in 2003 for the UK government. But it doesn't really know how to deal with a departing member state. So that's quite difficult because you have to sort of construct something. It may well be a one-off, you just don't know, but it's a very unusual situation to be in. This gets lawyers tremendously excited, and probably academics too, but it is just important to remember that, having to find your way. And the very obvious point to make from my own experience is it is obviously very different to be a third country and to be a member state. And I'm used to a negotiation in the council. It's a very different kind of negotiation. To go along, as I did for the kind of first negotiating round with David Davis, you're going to the Burley Mall, which I knew well. I worked there for just under 3 years for Barroso, and it's a very formal process. So the council negotiations, I knew it when it was a council of 15, were quite dynamic and quite informal. This is a much more formal negotiation. There's a long way between you and the union's negotiator on the other side, with some fairly weird flowers in between. I couldn't help noticing, with all the charm that the Burley Mall rooms have for those who spent time there. And you're using a microphone. You know, this is a sort of, you know, it's a different feel, that room, from some others I've been in. It's not always the case. Subsequently, I've been in much smaller rooms. You don't need a microphone. It's a much more human relationship, I would say. So it feels very different, obviously, than if you are a member state, and we're in this curious position of being both a member state and also, for the purposes of this, being treated in a different way. Some things are very familiar to anyone who's done EU negotiation. What we're negotiating is a treaty, so it is law. And as so often when you're negotiating from a British point of view with the European Union, most of the people on the other side have legal training or are lawyers, which is a wonderful thing. But it's quite different. UK side has outstanding lawyers, and I just say we have such good legal support. Really, it's a joy to work with them. Most of us are not legally trained, but you are negotiating, in the end, legal text most of the time, or words which we translate into legal text. And that's fairly familiar, and from that produces a fairly familiar dynamic to me of practitioners and lawyers, and what is legally possible, and what the practitioners say, well, that isn't going to work, and that is a very familiar dynamic. I think that this negotiation, because it's new and it hasn't been done before, like all negotiations, one of the trickiest points is the beginning. How are you actually going to start your sort of first grapple and clinch, as it were? And I always thought one of the things about the EU, which worked quite well, was it could turn almost any global crisis into a working group within about a week. And the sort of process which sits around it, which is very familiar, but actually this is a bit different. And how do you start that first grapple? It takes a bit of time. It doesn't happen just straight away. But it does happen. And once it has happened, you then get into a rhythm of the negotiation, and it becomes much more familiar. It's much more binary than a council negotiation as well, because it's just you and them, the union's negotiator, sitting opposite a table. There isn't a dynamic of going around the table in quite the same way. But once you've started, I think that what really matters is, do you know your stuff? And on the other side, you have people who've been doing this for many, many years. Now, British side, we have plenty of those, but there's deep expertise on the other side, and you've got to be able to match that, and you've got to know your stuff. And I like to think that over time we do. And then you've got to have relationships of trust. And once you've established that first grapple, and I think you've begun to talk to each other, you do establish those relationships of trust. And that facilitates a kind of grown-up negotiation. A few other things I'd observe. It is obviously an intensely political process, and therefore the civil servants are operating as they should be, under political guidance on both sides. You have to, both sides has to be very careful process of political preparation internally, whether that's inside the UK or with the 27, and the officials have to be very careful about that, make sure they have the appropriate clearances. And obviously it's a very public thing in a way, with enormous public interest. But the job of the civil servants is the job of the civil servants, which is to try and prepare options, follow the mandates, very familiar stuff. And that's no different from when I was negotiating, negotiating part of a member state. And there's a rhythm which you get to know, and it tends to follow around European councils, and that tends to be the moment, and you're working up to that. Another point I'd like to say is that it really is a negotiation. I think people kind of go, oh, come on, is it? But it is a negotiation. There's a time when you are kind of setting out your positions, and you begin to explore each other's positions, you begin to understand them and explain them. But there is a point at which you go, right, now we're negotiating, we're getting towards a deadline, our political masters have set us a target, an objective, and we need to get on with it. And there you do get into a fairly familiar negotiation. Again, not the dynamic of the council, but a negotiation between the two sides. So I think in some way, it is very familiar to those other EU negotiations. But I think we're learning what it's like to be, in due course, not yet, a third country. And that's different, and it requires different skills. And actually, one of the things we need to reflect on as a civil service is how we prepare for that, and what are the skills we need, and what is the knowledge which we need, and what are the relationships we need as a third country. But it's extremely interesting, it's extremely stimulating, it's tough, it's hard work, but that's, if you signed up to join working for DEXU, I think you knew what you were doing. There's a clue in the name of the department. And of course, we're also in the middle of it. We've done some stuff. I'm glad, we've managed to achieve stuff which people said, well, we're not sure you'll be able to get this by December. Well, we did. We're not sure we'll be able to get this by March, and we did. And that gives you a certain momentum and confidence and trust between the two sides about trying to move things forward and get to the next stage. So,
Alex, thanks. So just one question. I mean, you say, like in some ways other EU negotiations, but in scale, quite unlike anything the British civil service has had to do for decades. I mean, is the bandwidth there? It's a question which is asked often. Yeah,
it's an enormous challenge for the British state. Actually, if you look at my department, DEXU, it's doing some negotiating as part of a broad cross-Whitehall team. And one of the nice things is it is very cross-Whitehall. You have different departments leading on different issues. And that's just in stage one. I mean, you'll have much more of that in stage two. At the same time, DEXU is also leading this vast cross-government programme to prepare the British state for no longer being a member of the European Union. And that's a huge effort, covering almost every department. So it is very big in scale. But yeah, we're up for it. You can do it. And you just need to keep going. You need to keep kind of solving the problems, seeing what the next one is, and not stopping, just keeping moving forward.
Okay, keeping moving forward. Simon, do you want to go next? Where have we got to? What are the other 27 feeling? And tell us about your tie.
Tie. Well, what I want to talk about is the position of the 27 and the degree of unity. And looking through my tie collection, because I was going to be greeting some of our guests this morning, I thought I would dig out my presidency tie from the UK presidency from 1998, which was Tony Blair's first presidency. So, which unified Europe in a disapproval of the representation of each country through a star, particularly, Ambassador, the Italians who are unhappy about the pizza. Yes, long memories. So I just want to reflect a bit on why there's that unity. And whether that unity will continue. And I think a key part of that was the very successful way that the European Council, President, the Commission were able to frame the issue of Brexit in terms that other member states could get behind. And particularly the idea that in the immediate aftermath of the referendum that there was a risk of contagion, that it was challenging the very fundamental values of European integration, and that this was something that all member states needed to get behind. At the same time, I think it's also become apparent that for a lot of states, Brexit is not the priority issue for them within their European politics, let alone their more general world view. And the reason for that is not that Brexit is not important in of itself, it's that there are other issues which are more pressing. And if we think about the challenges that the EU faces, a lot of those issues are ones which are coming towards the EU, which are systemic, cross-cutting, and directly involve member states in very different ways. So we think about the continuing issues around Eurozone governance, we think about the migrant crisis that was very prevalent, particularly at the time of the referendum. And we also think about the difficult relations with Russia and more recently with the US. By contrast, Brexit looks like an issue that's going away. The UK is disengaging itself. It is seen as a relatively self-contained kind of issue. And in that sense, the incentive to get involved when the Commission particularly was presenting a very well-developed set of ideas about how to handle this looked very small. So when member states have had interests, particularly Ireland, but also we think about the Dutch or the Germans, the Commission has been able to work with those very closely. It's been much more open in its processes, keeping member states closely involved in that negotiation process. But helped by the fact that for many states, there hasn't been an immediate need to get more closely involved to challenge the kind of consensus that there is. Now, there's a question about whether that will still continue, and I think we need to break that down into two blocks. First of all, we need to think about the rest of the Article 50 process. And clearly, we have a question about how much of that 75% is the tricky part. And the tricky part is in the 25% that remains on that draft text. And particularly, we think about the Irish dimension, which I'm sure we are going to discuss a lot more, that how we resolve the different positions, how we move beyond the backstop option C model, that has been elaborated in that draft agreement, I think remains very unclear. The other issue, I think, is also going to be that some member states are going to start thinking about whether this is the moment to get side payments coming back into the text. And I think the fact that the Spanish government is again talking about the Gibraltar issue, I think might be a marker of that. So there are some immediate issues that will come up in the next 6 to 9 months. More problematically, though, I think as we move into the transition period, assuming that we get a withdrawal agreement, I think we're going to see much more scope for divergence between member states. Transition is the point at which we're discussing the future relationship. That's not an existential question. That comes down to more narrow economic interests, some issues around security cooperation, but trade and economic considerations, I think, will weigh more heavily. And at that point, we're going to see the tensions between those who want to maintain a close relationship economically, particularly those who have a high degree of exposure to the British economy, are going to be in a different position from those, for example, such as the French, who see opportunities to redouble internal integration within the EU. And I think, as we have discussed on Twitter, Jean-Claude and I, there's an issue around transition itself. At the moment, and it turns out that my one module of undergraduate EU law is not enough to overturn the expertise that Jean-Claude has. As it stands, the transition text doesn't seem to allow for extension, even by omission from having that mechanism. And if we have that text accepted as it is, then potentially we've ended up moving a cliff edge from March next year to the end of 2020. And at that point, the diverging issues and interests of those 27, I think, are going to raise a question about whether and how one might extend. And so there's a question about whether you have to put a mechanism in now or whether you have to do something very creative legally and politically to allow that to happen. So the process will still matter. Even though we're out of the time compressed Article 50 process, we're going to move into a time compressed transition process. And I think that those issues haven't really been considered all that much.
Okay, I know Catherine's going to talk a bit about Ireland, but I'm going to go to Jean-Claude first. You had a piece in Prospect this week which began with the sentence, "The Brexit mood is turning to optimism," and then you proceeded to be extremely pessimistic for the rest of the article about the coming 12 months. I mean, part of it, I think, was your concern about transition, which Simon has just explained. It seems to me that sometimes when there are legal blocks, political ways are found around them. But just tell me your view of the 12 months we have coming up.
I'm going to try to use my 5 minutes to give my personal opinion. First, thank you to the organizers to have invited me, because I'm apparently the only non-British in the game. But my personal opinion, not one of the European Union, what the opinion of France, my personal opinion where we are in these negotiations. Well, it's true that we have done, the negotiators have done a lot of work, and they have agreed on the money, the question of money, which was very sensible and very sensitive and very visible, the question of the rights of citizens, and they are recently agreed on the conditions of the transition period and on its duration. Okay, so conclusion, as you said, Mr. Chairman, 75% of the job done. I disagree totally with that. This was the easy part. This was the easy part. Now we have the real tough problems, which is the Irish issue and the trade relations in the future. I'm not talking about other kind of relations, because on this I think we should agree easily once the trade issue is done. Participation to some agencies, to some programs, cooperation in judicial cooperation against terrorism, foreign policy, aviation, Euratom, and so on and so forth. I think that would be easy, but the bulk of it is the trade. And on the trade and on the Irish issue, we have nothing close to an agreement yet. Okay, we have agreed to all these things I said, the three things I said, but under one condition, is that there is a withdrawal agreement which is concluded before the 29th of March next year, just in 1 year. This means that if you allow time to ratification, examination of this thing by the British Parliament to have a significant vote, and by the European Parliament, you need a few months. So let's say we have to finish that, to sign it by October. We have 7 months to do that. Okay, what are the positions? And we might come back on this, but the delays, I think, are very difficult to prolong. First, the transition period, first the extension of the Article 52 years is very difficult for political reasons, both in the UK and in the EU, but also because there are elections in the European Parliament at the end of May 2019, and nobody would like the UK to have a campaign on this and so on. Maybe Mr. Farage, I don't know. And for the transition period, I think for the time being, both parties have agreed on Article 121 of the draft of the Commission, and which says that it will finish on the 31st December 2020. Okay, they have time to change it, but they will not be possible to change it after the 29th March next year. And for the time being, so we have no extension, and we have to settle all these things first, to have the first agreement in 7 months, and then we have the, not 2 years, but 90 months to finish the second agreement on trade relations and on other cooperation. So to finish the first agreement, the two problems I said are the biggest one on the Irish border, control on road control, and on the trade relations. What is the position of the UK? Position of the UK, but Alex will correct me if I'm wrong, we will settle that in one go, because we will converge, we will have the same regulations as the EU, as are necessary for the goods and everything go through the border in Ireland between North and South, and thus we will benefit more or less of the single market for the whole of the UK, because we don't want a kind of border between East and West. Okay. And this is settled like that. That's the position of the UK, even if it's presented in the new package. It's more or less the let's us have the cake and eat it from the beginning. What is the position of the EU? Position of the EU is known, is transparent. It has been given very recently, on the 23rd of March, by the conclusion of the European Council, and it says, no, it's not possible. As the UK does not want single market obligations on the single market, the four freedoms, the Court of Justice, the primacy of the EU law, the enforcement mechanism, the same institutions, so on and so forth, it is not possible, and not the custom union either, by the way, for the time being at least, it's not possible to have, for the UK to have benefits of the single market. So we propose a FTA, more or less in the line of Canada, but of course every agreement is different from another. And this is it. And they describe in the directives of negotiation given to the Michel Barnier, the negotiator, that of course that means that there will be checks and controls of the goods, there will be no financial passport on financial services, and there will be negative consequences for the UK on a number of things. What is the position of the European Parliament, which has to say yes or no to the first agreement? Position has been given in a resolution. It's almost the same. No single market because you don't agree with the rules and conditions and so on and so forth. So how are we going to solve this in 7 months? I don't know. I think positions are much too far aside in order to be corrected. So I think that there is too much complacency now about that. The tranquility, because we have achieved this, we have achieved that. We have not solved the bulk of it. So I think the fair I have, and I'm very fair because I'm a friend of the UK, is that the UK will face in 7 months with the choice between either the hardest of Brexit at all, as you could dream, that is a cliff edge with WTO rules, which is a catastrophe for British economy, a catastrophe for some economies in the EU, by the way, and or to revoke Article 50. And what I say is that legally it is possible to revoke Article 50 and to remain in the same situation, status with the opt-outs and so on the UK has now. That's my personal legal opinion. I don't say it is, you have more chances to go to this way. I don't think so. I think there are very slim chances to go there. But what I'm afraid is we might go to a cliff edge.
Okay, Jean-Claude, thank you very much indeed. Catherine, I think you want to talk about Ireland, and without adding to the gloom, it appears to be one of the most difficult issues, clearly. But let's look at the counter-argument. I'm sure a lot of people said the Good Friday Agreement could never happen. It was impossible. The two sides were too far apart. Negotiations often come to agreements at the most unexpected times. What's your perspective on Ireland?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, your starting point obviously is a Good Friday Agreement, 20 years old this year, and one of the key symbolic aspects of the Good Friday Agreement was the removal of all infrastructure from the border. And that's why Brexit is proving such a challenge, because at the moment we have 3 options, and the options are no border, because you have effectively United Ireland, Ireland stays in the single market and the customs union, both north and south. That, of course, goes against Theresa May's red line that we're coming out of the customs union and the single market. Other option, very hard border, which of course means the reinstatement of physical infrastructure on the border, with all of the security implications that involves. I think it's striking that the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland came out very publicly and said in February that if there is any form of infrastructure, that will need to be guarded, and the police will become sitting ducks. Those are his words, not mine. And then the third possibility is the border down the Irish Sea, again, totally unacceptable to the DUP. So what we've got here is a really very difficult scenario to manage, but one that's got to be managed, not helped by the fact that I think there's a perception in Ireland, particularly in the north, that a lot of people in the UK do not get Northern Ireland. And I should say here that I declare a personal interest. I grew up in Northern Ireland as an English person, English girl. My father was a British civil servant, and we were terrorist targets the entire time I was growing up there. And so I feel very passionately, and I was very about Northern Ireland and how I'm desperate it doesn't go back to the situation it was in the 70s when I was growing up there. And what was really striking in the run-up to the referendum, UK and Change Europe did lots of town hall events, and virtually nobody ever raised the issue about Northern Ireland. We spent lots of time talking about immigration and money and so forth, but not Northern Ireland. So there's a sense that the British don't take Northern Ireland seriously, and certainly there's some polling evidence which supports that. Nevertheless, I think what we know is that the UK government is being forced to take it seriously, and that brings us to the crucial paragraph 49 of the December the 8th joint report. Now, the joint report is not legally binding in and of itself, although some people say that perhaps paragraph 49 might have some legal effect if everything else fails. Paragraph 49 identified 3 options. Option A, that there will be a special relationship between the UK and Ireland, or some sort of deal which will spell out the relationship between the UK and Northern Ireland over this particular issue. Option 2, essentially about technology. Technology will resolve this problem. Some magic border technology that doesn't exist anywhere in the world yet will resolve the problem. And then option C, which is now referred to as the fallback position, which is the full regulatory alignment, which essentially means staying in, at least for north and south of Ireland, in a unified customs union single market. And remember, you've got to have both. It wouldn't be good enough to resolve the problem just staying in the customs union, because it's not just the tariffs that are an issue on the border. What's the far bigger problem, in fact, are non-tariff barriers, which is the jargon for different regulatory standards. If you think that large parts of the trade between North and South are agricultural products have got to comply with animal welfare standards, sanitary and phytosanitary standards. And if they differ, then clearly there's got to be a board, there's got to be checks on that. So it's not good enough just to stay in the customs union. You've got to have the single market component as well. So how was that translated then into the withdrawal agreement? That was the agreement that was published on the 28th of February, which was discussed at the European Council. Well, what you see is the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. Option C, the fallback position, which is staying in this regulatory aligned space, essentially staying in the customs union single market, has now become the backstop and has become the default. And if all else fails, that will be the position for Ireland, assuming that the withdrawal agreement is successfully concluded. And I think the government has accepted that this needs to be put into legal terms, i.e. the fallback position will be in legal terms until something else can be agreed down the line in respect to the future trade negotiations. Now then that raises the question, what might those future trade negotiations say about the Northern Ireland border? Now, the UK has come up with some various proposals. Those who are charitable towards those proposals would describe them as imaginative. Those who are less charitable would describe them as somewhat fanciful, but they are various permutations about relying on technology to try and solve the problem, plus whether the UK carries on acting as part of the customs union and then tracking the goods to see whether those goods stay within the UK or move elsewhere. But I think although we can be very negative and very critical, the fact is that something's got to be done about the border. And what I do genuinely believe is that there is certainly appetite on the EU side to solve this problem. The EU gets the problem with the Northern Ireland border because, of course, lots of the member states have got border issues of their own. They know what border issues look like, and they are sensitive to that fact. And this is where I think there should be some compromise. I think there is some scope for some compromise. It may be that we can say, we can offer, that we do stay very close indeed to EU rules on goods. In fact, there's not a dramatic taste for the British public to disalign in respect of rules on widgets. The fact is, people don't feel passionate about technical standards, and the reality is that a lot of technical standards for goods will have to be replicated anyway, because the UK manufacturers will carry on trading with the EU, and because they'll carry on trading with the EU, they will have to comply with UK standards, whether the UK government requires them to do it or not. So I think there is some space for a deal over goods, over saying pretty close in respect of goods. Now, of course, people would come back and say, look, you are cherry-picking. But the EU's cherry-picking too. I mean, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. The EU's cherry-picking too, because the EU is saying, if the UK wants to stay close, we've got to comply with social law, environmental law, state aids, public procurement, and so forth. That's cherry-picking too. They're cherry-picking the bits of their acquis that they would like us to respect. Surely there should be a bit of give and take. And surely the give and take should be over the Northern Ireland border, which is so crucial for both sides. Thank you very much.
Catherine, thank you. Lots of questions there, and as Anand prevented anyone from asking a question to Tony Blair, I'm going to go straight to the audience. Do we have the microphones? We have one back there and one over there. So we'll take sort of 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we will. Yes, there's one here. Any other hands, please? There's one over there for the second microphone. If you could just give us your name and please keep the question relatively short.
Chris, thank you. Mark Johnston, question to Jean-Claude. The only speaker today from another member state, I note. Jean-Claude, on the political declaration in October, in your opinion, will that be of 27 or of 28? Does it matter for avoiding a dispute on the application of Article 50 if it's 27 or 28? And a slight follow-on, I know you were here to hear Tony Blair. He referred to the Prime Minister's promise in the Parliament on Monday about there would be sufficient detail in that political declaration in October. To what extent do you think that is realisable? Thank you very much.
Okay, the question at the back, do we have one there? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Neil Brady. Can I ask a kind of Hobbesian question?
Blimey, it's early for Hobbes, but...
Well, I mean, in relation to the EU, I mean, since the Singapore judgment in the ECJ, the EU pretty much controls trade negotiations. The Commission controls it. It's not a matter, really, for the 28, is it? And also, I'm not that great a fan of Mr. Varoufakis, but it says you're a technocracy in pursuit of illegitimate power and will hang on grimly, something like that. Is it not true, really, and the Northern Ireland example shows this, that the EU will get its way and Britain really isn't in a negotiation very much at all? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another one? Sir, did you? Yes, a question here. Let's take one more and then we'll go to the answers.
Thank you. John Ewan, my question's quite straightforward. How can this Irish issue be resolved?
Okay. How long have you got? Okay, let's begin. Jean-Claude, if you could take the first one, the declaration in October, 27 or 28, the political declaration.
Yeah, I did not understand which declaration. The declaration...
As I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the broad declaration about the future relationship, which is due to be agreed by October.
Next October, yeah.
Yes, that's correct. October this year.
Yeah, this declaration is a declaration which will be kind of annexed, not annexed because it will not be part of the withdrawal agreement, but a political declaration referred to this agreement. Obligatory, it's a declaration which has to be agreed by the 28. by the United Kingdom as well. Of course, it's part of the game. If we have not this political, in Article 50, it says we have to take into account of the future framework of relations, and obviously this is a thing which has to be agreed by both parties. On Northern Ireland, if I may, I heard Catherine saying that it's to EU to make a compromise. Well, I tend to disagree with that, first because it's not the EU which is provoking this problem. The EU is very attached to the Good Friday Agreement. But what you propose, frankly speaking, Catherine, is a little bit, we accept that there are holes in the border, we accept that there are frauds in the border, we accept that things which are imported from China by the UK, we are not going to check the origin and so on and so forth. So that's really impossible to accept. To be contrary to that, even to the WTO rules, but the EU will not accept that, I'm sorry.
Can I just go back to the first question, and Alex, your view on what your hopes are for the amount of detail that might be in that political declaration if it does come by October. Your former colleague, Sir Ivan Rogers, described it rather memorably as potentially highfalutin aspirational guff. I suspect you're hoping for something a bit better than that, but can you tell us what you can about
suspicions? Well, look, I'm not going to say more. I couldn't add to what the Prime Minister said on Monday, I think, in the House of Commons about the need for clarity about the future relationship. As part of that, I think it is important to have that clarity. You know, where are we going? What are we actually trying to achieve together? So I think we will try and get as much as we can in terms of that clarity. It's extremely important. So there's a lot of work to be done over the next few months. But of course, it has to be done at 28. Otherwise, it has no purpose, no meaning.
Yeah, just to add to what clarity, of course, as much as possible, but in a few months. And then the parties will have 21 months to agree to sign a treaty, even if we take only trade. And it will probably not be only trade. It should be an association agreement with a lot of things I referred to earlier. But even on trade, all specialists would tell you that in 21 months, it's totally impossible to finish an agreement like that. And we should at least finish it by signing it, not legally ratify it. We could wait and implement immediately the trade. But even 21 months, do you think it will be enough to settle that without prolonging the transition period?
Yes.
I take note.
I'm having flashbacks actually to listening to this guy about sort of 3 weeks before every momentous European Council, where he'd explained patiently to the ambassadors to the European Union why what they were asking for was totally impossible. And then somehow, if the will is there, quite a lot of things happen, and I think there's quite a strong will. But also, it's just such an unusual situation. I think there is no kind of easy comparator with this in terms of where you start from. You're not building things up from two distant jurisdictions. You're actually part of the same jurisdiction at the moment. It is a very unusual situation. So the precedents, of course, we listen very carefully, and there are many precedents, but it is a particular situation. So I think a lot will depend on the will of the two sides and what they actually want to get done. But I think there is a shared interest in trying to get clarity about the future relationship. I'm also reassured. I was talking to one of my colleagues, talking this morning about some negotiations and their experience of negotiations. And to be reassured, those of you who are true experts on the European Union, there is a point in these negotiations so far where at some point the lawyers on both sides just look at each other, shake their heads, look at their delegations and think it could all be so much better resolved if the lawyers could just go away and solve it all themselves.
Well, on that point, Simon, maybe you could address the question about whether this actually is a negotiation or more of a dictation of terms by the European Union as a stronger partner. I'm sure Alex would disagree with that, but your view on that?
I think a key point to remember is that whilst often here in the UK we talk about this as concessions by the UK to the EU, and this looks like a weak British position, the UK still retains a structural power, which is that it also has to agree to the terms of the withdrawal agreement. And the EU is not pursuing this as a punitive exercise. It has an interest, politically, economically, in security terms, to have a functioning, positive working relationship with the UK. So as much as the negotiations have been complicated, legally discussed, side over, the negotiation requires two parties. You can't have a negotiation with one party. So as much as you have occasional senses from European capitals that perhaps we should just present a document and the British take it or leave it, actually the much more common and predominant view is that the British have to be involved and have to agree to the terms that are there. And it's not about solving the British problem, it's about solving the problems of how we manage technically this withdrawal process whilst retaining as much of that relationship as is possible and potentially opening up new avenues for cooperation and collaboration. So there is a negotiation, it is meaningful. We do see that throughout the process where UK concerns have been reflected in the text in specific areas, and the entire EU detailed approach has been driven by an understanding of what the British are prepared to accept. So you haven't had the EU saying you must do a Norwegian-style EEA agreement because that's not viable. So it's easy to overlook that, but this is a meaningful process, and I think it will continue to be a meaningful process because otherwise, in the long run, the costs become all the more substantial.
Catherine, any thoughts on that and the question, what is the solution for the Irish border?
Well, let's just start with the idea that the world would be better run by lawyers. I actually think that would be correct, but sadly, politicians have a role to play, and because we are in this real world of politicians, I think it is important to recognise that there is a will on both sides to try and resolve this. I think it is very good news that the UK government seems to say much less than it used to do, that no deal is better than a bad deal. I think no deal would be catastrophic. And so I think the reality has dawned that actually we need a deal and there's a lot of work being done. Now, I absolutely hear what you say, Jean-Claude, that it's the UK what done it. It's the UK that is leaving the EU, and it's at the UK to come up with a solution to, for example, the Northern Ireland problem. But the reality is it's a negotiation, it's agreement, and there will need to be compromise on both sides, and I think we've got to be pragmatic about that. Now, that brings me then back to the Northern Ireland question, what is the solution? If there was a simple solution, somebody would have come up with it already. The reality is it's immensely difficult. Now, it is likely that some of the solution will lie in technology, but the technology is just not ready yet. It hasn't even been commissioned yet. So it can't possibly be in place by the 29th of March 2019. It probably won't be ready by the 31st of December 2020 either. And even the Prime Minister herself alluded to these problems in the liaison committee this week, which said actually we might need longer on the transition, or it's going to take us longer. Now, whether that means that we move from a transitional phase to an implementation phase, and then to perhaps a transition from the implementation to the New Deal, there are ways to do it. Now, there is a problem because Article 50 it doesn't even say anything about transition. Most people are pragmatic and say, well, it's implicit in Article 50. The problem is if transition gets too long, then it begins to look rather like a New Deal, and that should be done under different legal bases altogether. Now, the other way of doing it, to buy us some time, which most people think we will need, because we're really talking such a short window before the end of the transition, i.e. the end of 2020. One possibility is to delay the coming into force of the withdrawal agreement and have some wriggle room there. And although we will have notionally left, the withdrawal agreement comes into force further down the line, or you have a stage coming into force of the withdrawal agreement. And that's why it's deeply unfortunate that the withdrawal bill has a particular date fixed as exit day, although actually the recent amendments in the Commons have given some flexibility there, so you might have different exit days for different things. These things are nuanced and sophisticated. It's not a big bang approach.
Okay, so nuance and sophistication, but in the end it's going to come down to politics. Now, there's lots of hands now. I did promise the guy who's hiding behind the pillar, at least hiding from me, so we're going to get a microphone there. And where's the other microphone? Well, you're not only hiding from my perspective, obviously, I wasn't. And then, where's the other mic? So there's can you come down this area? There's several down. Yes.
Raphael Baer from The Guardian. It's a short, easy question. I would like to invite everyone on the panel, if they could please, to describe what they envisage the situation will look like regarding Gibraltar in the final status of Brexit.
Okay, Gibraltar. Yes, one here, Peter. And then the woman here.
Peter Foster from The Telegraph. Just one quickly to Jean-Claude. The Good Friday Agreement both allowed nationalists to feel like they were part of a united Ireland, but also unionists to feel like they remained part of the United Kingdom. You say it's not up to the European Union to make compromises, but if the European Union supports the Good Friday Agreement, its support must cut both ways. And the way option C is currently drafted in the treaty, it essentially puts a border in the Irish Sea, and that's not commensurate with the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. My next question follows from that: is if we do get the kind of fudges and compromises on goods alignment that we're clearly moving towards from Mansion House, etc., that Catherine mentions, what's left in terms of our ability to, get into this free trade narrative, etc., and how quickly do you get into a situation where politically the deal is unsaleable? Alexander Downer, the outgoing Australian commissioner, saying last night a country of Britain's standing would be mad to leave itself shackled as a rule taker to Europe. Because all of that stuff Boris Johnson complains about would be there in triplicate because the French and the Germans would be changing the rules to do us in the whole time. And very quickly you get back into a very negative political conversation. Is there a deal here that satisfies that?
And then the lady here.
Thank you, Hazel Prowse. Last time I looked, there are about 300,000 pages of regulations, and I looked across at the time to my Encyclopedia Britannica, which is only a fifth of that size. Wouldn't it be better to look at things either by an industry, by sport? We can play football with the French and the Germans. We can play cricket with the Australians and New Zealanders. You should look at it another way. I used to tell the men in my engineering projects it takes 9 months to produce a baby. Get ready. Why are we not out of the Fourth Reich now?
Okay, fine. Right. First of all, Gibraltar. Let's go from. You wanted a sentence. Let's go from left to right. Alex.
The British government's position is well known, and its support for Gibraltar, and that the withdrawal agreement applies to Gibraltar. And I've nothing to add to what our ministers have said many times on this subject. So it's very clear what our position is.
Jean-Claude, Gibraltar. A place you
there are
fear to
probably
tread.
contacts now between British government and Spanish government, and I don't know anything about that.
Thoughts on Gibraltar?
It's tricky. The Spanish now are just getting themselves organised to cause issues about Gibraltar. It's the area where they've got maximum leverage, and so they'll want something in return.
A thing that's maybe not always so discussed in the Gibraltar issue is the extent to which Gibraltar is now embedded in the southern Spanish economy, that there is vast traffic across the border to Gibraltar, and that there would be a degree of economic cost that is really quite substantial. I would imagine that you might end up with a bilateral process, a commitment to have an ongoing bilateral process to continue discussing, probably to no great effect. But I think you will also see that other member states will not want to let all of the hard work that they have done and that they are going to do be derailed by this issue. And Spain has not done the kind of work that the Irish government has done. Ireland has done exemplary diplomatic work in advancing and embedding its issues in the Article 50 process. Spain has not done that. It looks more nakedly political as a point, and that probably will not help the Spanish in the long run.
Okay. Who wants to address the question? If I understood the question, is that we should get out now. I mean, we do play cricket with the Australians, but now we know they cheat as well. But why don't we just leave now?
On the problem,
the
problem of EU being tough and not ready to compromise. No, EU, I think, is ready to compromise and has compromised a lot. I think, Alex, you should on a number of things. You have won the game in a number of things, and all the results on the citizens, on the money, and on the transition are not what the positions of the EU were in the beginning. Same thing for the future. But you cannot ask the EU to abandon its interest. The single market is the soul, is the big success of the EU. If we put off the credibility, the integrity of the single market, what remains? So we have to be, the EU has to be tough on single market, because if not, if it offers something to the UK, it will offer it to Switzerland, with which it is negotiating now, with Norway and Iceland, and so on and so forth. So they have to, and same thing on the border. They are ready, I think, to do something, but it has not to open too big a hole in the rules governing the borders and in ports which are not controlled.
I think one very limited answer is that a UK that is talking about becoming global Britain, about concluding new agreements with third countries, legal agreements, for it then not to follow the legal process of leaving the EU through Article 50, which has this 2-year window, would look like a problematic sell. That at a point where they're saying we want to set up new agreements, to then say we're not really respecting the way that the treaties have been set up, that we agreed to and signed up, is a problem. So I think that is a very limited answer, but that's part of it.
Chris,
yes, no, please.
It's sort of broader point. I think that how we leave matters a lot, because how we joined conditioned to an extent the nature of our relationship with the European Union. And the Prime Minister talks a lot about wanting a sustainable agreement. If you look at how we joined, kind of kicked around the idea, and then Messina, no, it's not for us. We stayed away, then we wanted to join, and then we're told no twice, and then we join. This was a messy process which led to consequences, including, in the view of the incoming Prime Minister, very soon after we joined, an unsustainable treaty of accession, then negotiated again, put to a referendum. I just think how we leave matters a lot, because the UK is still going to be here. The European Union is still going to be there. The member states are still going to be there. The depth and complexity of these relations they're very deep. How we leave matters a great deal, and it needs to be sustainable for both sides.
Catherine?
On your practical point, why can't we just go now? Well, the answer is we're not ready. The fact is that if we went now, presumably there would have to be customs duties would have to be imposed at the border. There's no mechanism for collecting them. There's nothing. And even if we, as a UK, unilaterally decided no customs duties, the French would have to impose them. And so the gridlock in Dover would be the same, which side of the border the customs duties were imposed. That's just one narrow area. If you look at any area, whether you look at medicines, the UK and Changing Europe's done a very good report on the implications of just withdrawing without a deal in respect of medicines, in respect of transfer of key emergency packages of medicines for crisis situations. We are just not ready. There hasn't been planning. So it would be disastrous to go straight away. Going back to Peter's question, which is if you start nibbling away and do anything other than the hardest of hard Brexits, the whole thing unravels and we're no longer a global player, which is essentially what I read the Australian ambassador to have said earlier this week. I think here we've got to show a bit of realism. Goods are only 15% of our economy. Services, make up the remaining 70-80% of the economy. What we should be looking for is particularly looking for new generation trade deals, looking in them in respect of services rather than less so than goods. As far as goods is concerned, there is an indisputable rule that the further you travel, the less trade there is. The fact is, it would be marvellous to have a trade deal with Australia, but it only accounts for about 1% of our trade. Even if we double it, it's minuscule in comparison with the trade that we do with the EU. About 40% of our trade in goods is with the EU. Therefore, the EU will still be dictating terms because our manufacturers will have to manufacture in accordance with EU rules because they won't be able to sell into the EU market without it. Given that fact, this may be the way forward in respect to the Northern Ireland border.
Right. Now, Tony Blair left the stage on time, which may have come as a surprise to Gordon Brown, but if he can do it, if he can do it, we should do the same. So I think we've probably got time for, unless anyone's nodding or telling or doing this at me, they're not. We've got time for 2 more questions, I think. So let's go. Can we go one right at the back, because people at the back always get ignored. There's a woman right at the back, and the gentleman in front of her as well.
Thank you, Paula. My name's Paula.
Can you stand up so we can hear you? Thank you.
Again on Northern Ireland, on the backstop, people were saying, the EU overplayed its hand there. But because of the section that was there really to appease the DUP about no regulatory divergence between East and West, is it not the case that that would have been overstepping the mark if that was in the legal text, because that would have been dictating something about the UK internal market? And secondly, probably one for Alex, that if we can have technology to provide a frictionless border, a frictionless land border, why can't technology provide a frictionless border at the sea?
Okay, and then the gentleman here.
Morning, hi, Toby Abbs from Catalyst Development. We're a financial consultancy, so obviously I'm going to ask about equivalence. There was an annex added kind of in the same time as the transition agreement, which mentioned enhanced equivalence or improved equivalence. What could that look like?
Northern Ireland again. Who wants to take on the East-West issue? And can you have a frictionless border using technology on the sea?
Well, of course, all things are possible, but I suspect the answer to your question is more political rather than technological or legal. That it is would be a political red line for the DUP, because even though you won't see a physical border down the Irish Sea, indeed you wouldn't see it even if there was a United Ireland, you wouldn't see a physical border. We're not talking about a wall. The fact is that it's a psychological border, and it means that there would be a United Ireland, at least for economic purposes. It's too politically sensitive for the DUP and for the loyalist community.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm afraid I've forgotten what the question was, but there's a financial services question.
The heightened alignment, regulatory alignment.
Equivalence, yes. I'm looking at you.
Let's see. I think that what you see, of course, in the 27's text produced last week is the beginning of the opening out of these issues. Air transport, financial services. It gives you a sense that this is going to be an economic agreement of a very broad in scope. I suspect there are many more issues. Energy, I'd certainly mention. You need a customs agreement. There's all kinds of things which are going to get put into this economic agreement. The UK, and I love Canada, but the UK is just not Canada. Canada does not have, as far as when I last looked, a tunnel through to the European Union and road and rail links. So it's going to be very different. I can't pretend to be an expert on financial services. What's clear, now Chancellor's already given a speech on this a few weeks ago, what's clear is that what happens inside the jurisdiction of the EU on financial services has significant impacts on financial stability in the UK and vice versa. In other words, because of the degree of integration of financial services, you are going to need a very strong basis of cooperation. And I think there will be enormous economic flows between the two. How you do that, what kind of instruments you do in order to do that is exactly going to be the subject of a negotiation. The Chancellor set out some of the ways in which we think we can do it. But again, it strikes me an area where just kind of operating the classical free trade agreement doesn't work because there's so much depth to that economic relationship in financial services, but in lots of other areas as well. I mean, aviation, the number of flights. I think it's Marbella gets the most number of flights of any place in the European Union from the UK. You kind of see why on a day like today as well. But so I think all of this is really, what it illustrates is there is a very broad range of interests of the EU, and you're going to have to connect those with the UK in instruments, some which exist already, some which may not exist already. But if there is a will on the two sides to try and create those instruments, then I think there usually is, in the end, a way.
Okay, just very briefly, last thing. Can I ask all four of you, and apologies to those who had questions we couldn't get to, just in 30 seconds each, what's the one thing in the negotiations we should be looking out for in the coming months? Simon, boom.
The one thing is everyone wants a deal. The problem is that wanting it doesn't get it. And the default end of Article 50 is that the UK leaves without a deal. And I think that's the thing to look at.
Transition, can it be extended?
That was less than 30 seconds. I like that. Jean-Claude.
Well, I would say everyone wants a deal, yes, but a deal where United Kingdom is insisting on having something which is more or less single market, for example, on financial services, without having the rules and duties of member states on single market will not work. So there's a danger.
And the last word from Dexu?
Is this a deal based on the will and the reality or on the precedent? What you're trying to do is to create a new set of rights and obligations. There's a Norway set balance, there's a being a member state balance, there's a Canada balance. Actually, what we're trying to do is to find that new balance. I don't think that balance exists at the moment in the existing precedents, because the reality of the UK is just different. Not better, not worse, but different from other countries. How to strike that balance is the key.
Okay, Alex, Jean-Claude, Simon, Catherine, thank you very much. I think you have John Curtis up next. Thank you for listening.